Welcome, Michael. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Leading with Body Intelligence. So excited to have you here
Great to be here,
today.
Jennifer. Thanks, me too. Looking forward to the discussion
Yeah,
very much.
me as well. To get things started, would you please introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. So I have sort of a double life, right? So on one hand, I'm a professor of leadership and organizational change at the IMD Business School, which is in Lausanne, Switzerland. But I'm also the co-founder of a leadership development executive coaching company called Genesis Advisors, which is based mostly in the United States, although we operate globally. I'm probably best known for the work I've done on accelerating leadership transitions in general, and the book called The First 90 Days in particular. Uh, a lot of my research historically has focused on helping leaders successfully take new roles, but of course I've branched out somewhat beyond that. Yeah, that's originally from Canada. Originally trained as an electrical engineer. I describe myself as a recovering engineer, right? I quite early got more interested in the human side, less in the technology side, although I still maintain a strong interest in technology. I've been doing some writing about AI and leadership these days, which of course
Sure.
almost everybody is, but there it is, right? But great to
Yeah.
be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you here, Michael. And that's something we have in common with the mentioning your technical background, because I have that too. And I
Mm.
had to make a choice. But what I loved more, and it was difficult, technical or people. And people won over the won over technology for me, but I still have quite an interest there.
Yeah, I
Tell
saw your
us.
backgrounds in like telecom and analysis, and I thought, that's got to be a pretty interesting story just of how you personally, kind of move from the analytics side to the the in quotes human or emotional side, and then the work you've been doing, right, which is very deep work, I
Yes.
think, on emotion.
Yes. Yeah, it has definitely not been a linear path, and it really has involved me inadvertently creating my own apprenticeship in a good
Mm.
way, which has gotten me where I am today, which I'm very happy about. Now, you
Well, I'd love to tell
mentioned,
you that my career path has been this perfectly planned sequence of of moves, but that's absolutely not the case, right? But it's kind of fun and interesting anyhow. So good stuff.
yeah. Well, speaking of that, take us kind of on the journey of how
Sure.
you have gotten to where you are today. The work that you're well known for, that your latest book, what inspired you to write this new book, and just would love to hear it all.
Sure. So, as I said, I grew up in a small town in Canada, Northern Ontario originally. Always was good at math and science, right? So, I mean, this is the common path that takes people into something like engineering, right? Um, went to, well-regarded university in Canada for electrical engineering. Pretty early discovered I didn't really love engineering. It was mostly math and science, and wasn't really about design that much, and I wasn't really that enamored of it. And I sort of almost dropped out of university, and then took a little time off, came back, finished the degree. But I very quickly then started to move more towards management and leadership kinds of topics. Worked for a big power utility in Canada for a few years. Convinced myself that I had no future in hierarchy, Jennifer, right? I describe myself sometimes as unemployable, right? I mean, it's fine if I'm in charge. It's not so great if, anybody else is, right? So, yeah, a little ungovernable, I think, is part of my problem. But yeah, so I started to think about what to do. I went back to start uh, an MBA law degree. Did the first year of the MBA program, loved it. Did the first year of law, hated it. Um, I just don't have the brain for legal thinking. Became eminently clear very quickly. But I also started working for a professor at the business school I was at, and he was this amazing teacher, researcher, consultant. And I thought, geez, it was the first time I can remember thinking, I want to be like that person, right? That's what I want to do. And so, and he had gone to Harvard to do his doctorate at Harvard, at the Harvard Business School. And so I applied to go to the Harvard Business School. I was the only school I applied to, which is in retrospect a little bit ambitious of me, but fortunately I got in, and yeah, did my doctorate at HBS. I was focusing initially mostly on new product development because that was the area that I was in. The guy that was my mentor was in sort of technology and operations management. It was kind of natural from an engineering point of view to do that. But I quickly got interested in, and this is where I think the transition into the more psychological side kind of happened. I got very interested in negotiation. And so I kind of switched my major a little bit, got a thesis supervisor that was very knowledgeable about negotiation. At that point, Harvard was kind of the hotspot for negotiation, right? The Harvard Negotiation Project, which I was part of. Some of the leading lights like Roger Fisher and others, Bill Urey, who were studying negotiation and writing about negotiation, getting to yes, getting past no. And so that was kind of the transition point for me to get involved with that. And then I graduated from the PhD program, and for a variety of personal reasons, wanted to stay in the Boston area. And I had a couple of good offers. I could have gone to Wharton, to their decision sciences group, probably the right answer in some senses. But I got a chance to go to the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, initially studying sort of government operations, which I found I had absolutely no interest in whatsoever. But fortunately, the negotiation guy, at the school left. And so, as organizations do sometimes, Jennifer, they look around and say, now, who do we have that could fill that spot, right? Yes, you're now our negotiation guy. Yeah. And so, and the Kennedy School, I don't know if you know the Kennedy School, but it's a combination of, sort of classic master's programs, but also executive education, lots of national defense kind of stuff, mid-career stuff. And so they started putting me in front of these audiences that were kind of generals and admirals and, to teach about negotiation. And, it was pretty traumatic, right? I mean, you're interested in trauma, right? This was, not major trauma, but minor trauma, right? Of kind of realizing how little I knew about it. And so I embarked on a whole sort of series of studies about international diplomacy, Bosnia, Somalia, North Korea, the Gulf Wars. I spent some time working for the Paris Center for Peace in Tel Aviv, helping young negotiators. I kind of transmuted myself into a negotiation and diplomacy kind of person. And then I went from there back to the business school to teach negotiation, but I've always sort of brought that knowledge of diplomacy and politics along with me, right? And so, the first 90 days when it got published kind of took over my life, right? And so I became Mr. Transition, right? Almost by default. But my first love is really negotiation and diplomacy, right? And so, that sort of work is infused into pretty much all the writing I do. The first 90 days has a chapter about building alliances that kind of pulls in that work. The new book, The Six Disciplines of Strategic Thinking, has a chapter on political savvy that pulls in that work. And so that's kind of the way it all combines. Yeah, and that's sort of the pathway. I mean, I didn't get tenure at Harvard, which I think in retrospect was a great thing in some ways. It almost exactly coincided with the publication of the first 90 days, which kind of took off like a rocket. And so, I left at that point and founded the consulting company and started doing work around first 90 days for, leaders and clients. Eventually sort of found my way back into the academic side because I love to teach so much, right? And so I really was missing the teaching and the kind of the interchange that goes on at a really great academic institution. We spent a year over here in Switzerland at IMD, loved it, and have stayed on teaching at IMD, not full time. I'm basically a 60% professor. That's 60% of time, not 60% of capability. But
yes,
yeah,
good distinction.
Yeah, it's important. 60% professor. What does that mean? Yeah, so that's kind of how my life works now, right? So I teach a few programs at IMD. One of our senior executive programs called Transition to Business Leadership, right, which is about stepping up to senior leadership levels. I also teach a variation of my first 90 days program there. And then I also do coaching, come consulting kind of work with with my own clients. There, it's usually a combination of coaching people, taking new senior roles, but also helping them sort of assess and develop their teams because those things go together
Mhm.
pretty naturally. That's a
Is is
and again,
there
I'd love to tell you that was a perfectly planned sequence of events, right? But you can probably tell by the discussions that were kind of like, a random walk through a lot of things.
and I think that, I mean, number one, to me, that makes you very relatable.
Mm.
And number two, I can offers, I mean, from that experience, offers an opportunity to really bring yourself into your teaching and your writing and create a helpful context for people because life is a series of
Forks in the road,
interactions of yeses and nos and sticking with it, which I hear in your story, and that the nos have helped inform some of the yeses that have, you
100%.
know, brought you to where you are and
Yeah,
helping people in the
100%.
way that they need to be helped.
Yeah, no, 100%, right? And I guess the other part of it, it's funny you're getting me thinking about it a little bit, right? Is, I've never sort of come out of the background that qualifies me to do what I do, right? I mean, I wasn't a political scientist. I wasn't, a national security analyst. My wife is, trained at the Rand Corporation, did a PhD in policy analysis, was a defense analyst in a previous life, right? Like that's a logical background to be doing the kind of work in diplomacy, right? Coming out of a background of, engineering and new product development, the negotiation was kind of the bridge, right? But there was no natural background, right? And and I think that's actually been a theme in my career, right? Likewise, I didn't come out of a leadership background. I didn't come out of a psychology background. I didn't come out of, my PhD was in game and decision theory and negotiation theory, right? So I've kind of, but I think there's something there that's about, um, you know, to a degree coming at an area somewhat fresh and unencumbered by kind of the conventional orthodoxy. I never really played the academic game particularly well, Jennifer. So
Mhm.
falling into line around people's schools of thought was never something that was terribly important to me. If it had been, I probably would have gotten tenure, but on the other hand, I wouldn't have done a bunch of the work I've done, right? Because I think you have to be willing sometimes to not care too deeply about what people think, right? I mean, I've had
Yes.
multiple points in my career where people have said, you shouldn't be doing this. I'm like,
Mm.
including the writing of the first 90 days, right? If you want to get tenure, you shouldn't really be doing that, right?
Mm.
Well, I wasn't going to get tenure anyway. I figured, so why not do what I care about, right? Um,
I feel
yeah.
in good company with you, Michael, because I definitely, as I alluded to earlier, my path has not been linear either. I mean, it took me 10 years to get a 2-year degree.
Mhm.
But I learned in in the working world. That's where
Yep.
I excelled. That's where, like I said, I inadvertently created my own apprenticeship, which
Yep.
served me extremely well, brought me to where I am today. And when I think back to it, when I first went to college, there was this one class. It was called Human Relations, and I'm like,
Mm.
wow, I really like this, and I'm good at it. But what can I do with it?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so then I
yeah, yeah,
continued
yeah.
down the technology path, only to be brought back to
Yeah.
my
Well,
real
there is
love.
this tendency, right, to be pulled back to what you're actually deeply involved in and interested in, right? So
Yeah.
it is.
And it's not
But
necessarily an
when
easy
you say an
path.
apprenticeship, no, not at all. When you say an apprenticeship, what does that mean? I mean, what does that consist of?
Well, what I mean by that is, you mentioned working for a utility. I did as well. And then also, my first job was in a brokerage company, and kind of that surprise, you're going to be doing this. That
Mm.
that was I started out as a switchboard operator, and then I was told, "Hey, there's going to be a memo coming out tomorrow, and it's going to list you as the backup to the system administrator for our new phone system." I knew nothing about phone systems, right? But
Right.
I learned. And
Yeah.
the techs, they were so willing, because I asked, can I follow you around and learn from you? And they were great, great teachers. And then same company, I took a stint in human resources. And speaking of negotiation, I love the telephony part so much. I negotiated. Can I bring my telephony responsibilities with me? They allowed that.
Mm,
The
mm,
next stop was the utility where I, really got baptized by fire. Really got to see the full scope of things because I learned how to do punch downs. I learned how the cables came
mm.
in. I planned the programming, all of those pieces. And again, was learning from people that were more
Yeah.
experienced and so willing to share with me. Then I went on to Toyota Financial Services. That's where I got into the reporting end of things. And
Mm,
we had a low, and so then there was somebody that knew Unix. I wanted to learn Unix. He taught me Unix,
mm,
and then I learned shell scripting. What a combination!
mm.
Shell scripting to coaching. I don't, that. But here I
No,
am.
but there's no, but there's something important. I think I can relate, right? I think apprenticeship is underestimated in its
Yeah.
importance, right? And I think that sort of learning and growth mindset, that ability to continue to do that
Mhm.
going forward is super important. I mentioned the latest book I wrote was on strategic thinking, and one of
Yes.
the points I make about it is that apprenticeship is a really important way to learn to be a strategic thinker, right? I mean,
Hmm.
reading stuff obviously is valuable, but working with someone who's a great strategic thinker and seeing how they see the world, and how they
Yes.
operate in the world, I think turns out to be super, super important, right? And I won't be surprised that, apprenticeship, if becomes even more important as a learning mode given all of what's going on, right?
Yeah.
Because let's face it, and any body of um, codified knowledge today is something that AI can do in many cases already better than humans can.
Hmm.
But those remaining kind of capabilities of synthesis, of creativity, of heart, um, of judgment, of connection, of emotion, I think are going to continue to be important, right? And I think that
Yeah.
one way you learn that is just through the experience of working with people that
Hmm.
have those capabilities. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, that distinguishes us from AI, because that makes us human. And
Yeah, I mean,
it,
what's your? I'm always curious. I always ask people sort of what's your view of AI and where you think things are going, right? I mean, I'll give you mine too, but I think it's yeah,
yeah. Well, I'll tell you, my personal thoughts about it. I have no idea where it's going. I'm excited to see where it's going. But for me right now, I find it a really helpful tool because I'm kind of a big picture thinker.
yep,
And so it's hard for me to get my thoughts down into a cohesive
yeah,
easily, unconcise statement. So I use the, Chat GBT and Grammarly to help
hmm,
me, clean up my you know, the
absolutely,
all of the punctuation and that kind of thing, but also find ways to, I write it up, I stick it in, into Chat GBT, ask it to, refine it. And then, I take it back. It's still my own, but with some help. So
yeah,
I'm kind of excited for us that folks that are maybe a little more, you know, on the big picture thinking side, maybe the neurodivergent, I'm very curious to how it can be used as a medium to get more ideas out there where people can understand them, relate to them, and do something with them.
absolutely. Very similar. I use AI tools every day now, a lot,
Uh-huh.
in exactly the kind of ways you're describing. They're almost like my conversation partners, but they're also able to kind of synthesize stuff, for me. And the uses vary, right? From idea generation through, clean up this, this document a little bit, lightly edit this
Mhm.
document, right? I think, what people need to move beyond is seeing it as kind of like a search on steroids tool, right? I mean,
Mm,
search is
mhm.
valuable, right? And you can
Right.
use this thing to tell me about X, right? But I've been writing a little bit lately about kind of how you use it as a strategic thinking partner, right?
Yes.
And it's incredibly powerful to do that. And I think every leader should be engaged in it, right? I think what's a little
Mhm.
daunting about it is just, the list of things that it can do better than humans is an ever growing list, right? And every time a new
Mhm.
version comes out, it's kind of even more capable. And you work with ChatGPT. I work a lot these days with ChatGPT, but also with a system called Claude
Oh, yes.
from
I've heard of
Anthropic.
that.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's
Hmm.
amazing,
It's
right?
good.
It's very
Yeah.
fluid. It's very conversational.
Hmm.
You know, I, I often feel like I'm having a bit of a conversation with a particularly smart, colleague, right? Increasingly smarter than I am. But I think to your point, right, being able to use it to generate ideas, synthesize ideas is something I think that really is important. But then the question becomes sort of what is it that human beings are still going to contribute, right? And I think it's
Hmm.
back to what we were just talking about, which is that ability to contextualize a culture, connect, provide the very deep human element that's still, I think, required of leadership is,
Hmm.
now, who knows where AI is going, right? It may be that AI eventually will do all those things. And whenever someone says to me, well, AI can't do X, I always say you want to add the word yet to that statement, right? AI
Yes.
can't do X yet. Maybe it will,
Yes.
maybe it won't. We'll see. But it's a huge
Hmm.
challenge, Jennifer, right? I mean,
Yeah.
and I think it's gonna challenge us individually and collectively in really profound ways. And my sense is it's just
Hmm.
getting going in some senses, right? We
Yeah.
haven't really seen the deeper impacts that I think it's going to have on the world yet.
Hmm.
What they're
What
going to
I would
be.
like to see, I think, of it is that I think it can um, free us up to be more present and to execute on things that thinking takes a lot of energy, and we need to think. And if we can have a little help in that area, we still, discern and
Absolutely.
working together, as human synergy coming together. I don't think AI, again, it goes back to it's not human, but I think it can be a resource for us. My biggest concern, and I think our biggest roadblock, would be having fear of it. And this leads into kind of my work of real and perceived threat. And to me, AI would be a perceived threat. It's not life or death, but when we're in the threat response, in fear, then we are influenced by the amygdala. We lose access to our prefrontal cortex, where our strategic thinking is. And so if we can find ourselves in a place where we can feel safe, or at least safe enough, I've, it's my thought that we can really benefit in some, unknown ways of this extra resource. I want to hear more about what you're thinking.
No, no, no. I think that's really right, right. And I've been speaking a little bit about it, and I use two visual. I've been using two visual metaphors, which if it's okay, I'm going to show you
Oh,
quickly,
yes,
right? And one
please.
is the fear based. Oh, I'm not allowed to share, so never mind.
Oh.
Um, I
Can you send them
don't.
to
I
me
mean,
and I'll
yeah,
attach
yeah.
them to
Or if
the.
you could just make me a co-host at some point, but let's just keep talking.
Okay, okay, yep.
Yeah. No, so I mean, the metaphor I use the most these days is surfing the tsunami, right? That you need to be able to recognize that there's this wave coming of technology, and you need to get on your surfboard and get on that wave and do the best you can, right? And what you don't want to be is kind of a dinosaur watching the asteroid, coming, right? And I use those two
Right.
visual metaphors
Yeah.
as a way to talk about, what's going on. I see even in senior executives some of the fear you're talking about, and I think, wow, it's just so counterproductive to be engaged, to be caught in a fear loop around this, because if you're not willing to embrace this, if you're not willing to be the surfer, right, on the top of all this,
Hmm.
the prospects are not good for you. They're not good for your organization, right? And so now I think we're coming through the initial kind of shock, right? I think there was a big shock associated for many people, right, with ChatGPT when it emerged. I think like you, because I had a technical and technological background, I wasn't kind of too um, overwhelmed by it. And my oldest son actually runs an AI startup in Toronto, and so basically a week after 10 days after ChatGPT was first released in November 2022, he sent this link to me and said, "Dad, you need to see this," right? And
Uh-huh.
because I had a computer background and some tech background, I started playing with it. And it's just remarkable what it can do, right? But
Yeah.
many people my age are not engaging with the technology the way that they need to, right? And it's not going to
Hmm.
serve them well. It's not going to serve their organizations well, right? And that was
Yeah.
really what got me down the road of kind of really focusing in on writing more about AI and leadership, right? And the intersection between the two, and how does
Hmm.
it change leadership, right? Well, it changes leadership fairly substantially
It
because you've got
does.
these partners. You can talk through a little bit about, well, how should I make change happen in the organization, right? But you can't. The system still can't really help you deal with the hard questions of how do I help people move along through this. It can offer you ideas, yeah, but it can't really
Yes.
offer you necessarily solutions to it. So
And
yeah,
I think that's where emotional
super interesting.
regulation comes in. And,
Yeah,
one of the very simple, I mean, there's a lot of strategies, and most of my clients say, that's super simple. I just didn't know. But one
yeah,
is, when you feel that impulse of fear, being able to pause and ask, is this unsafe or just uncomfortable? What that does, if you can, because the body knows first, if you can
yeah.
recognize that within the 6 seconds before you get flooded with the stress hormones that cut you temporarily off from your prefrontal cortex, asking things like, is this unsafe or just uncomfortable, keeps you connected to your
That's
prefrontal
such a great
cortex,
question.
where you can exercise your strategic thinking like you've written about. So I think your book is
Yeah.
really timely.
Oh, thank you. No, it's funny that I think we've got multiple points of connection around emotional regulation. You know, um, and because as we've talked about, I do a lot of work around leaders taking new roles, and
Yes,
when you're in a transition, it can be a very stressful time, right?
absolutely.
And so you can be a little bit more activated or become activated more easily, right?
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
so I've increasingly come to believe, this is going to be a big duh for you, but I increasingly come to believe that capacity to regulate your emotions, always important for leaders, but
Right.
particularly important when you're going through a stressful experience like taking a new role, right? And
Yes.
it's not hugely surprising, because at one level, because the research has sort of shown that people are more vulnerable to their derailers, right, when they're under stress
Yeah.
than they are when they're not.
Hmm.
Again, a
Hmm.
shocking finding, right? But there it is.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
think it does come down to this idea of emotional regulation and how you engage in doing it, right?
Hmm.
Now, I think that, for me then, and I know you've written about this, it's then okay. Yeah, that seems super important, but
Hmm.
how do we do that in real time, right? And you know, uh, you're engaged in a meeting, you're under stress, something triggers you. Um, you
Hmm.
start to feel yourself, getting triggered in the ways that we know people get triggered. And we know, to your point, that when people are triggered, the rationality kind of goes out the window
Yeah.
pretty quickly, right?
Hmm.
But so I guess I'm super interested in what you're doing, right? Because I see the applicability to the sorts of leaders that I work with, right? And
Yeah.
I'd love to know a bit more about sort of how you got interested in the somatic stuff, but also what do you tell your clients about that, right? Like if I'm coaching a leader, who's being is challenged with that emotional regulation, gets triggered fairly easily,
Hmm.
goes off, and does damage of some form, what do I say to that person? I guess is the question, or how do I help that person? And I think you gave me a
Yeah.
clue, by the way, that is this unsafe or uncomfortable?
Yep.
That's an interesting, yeah, that's a
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
interesting way to kind of frame it, right? Because you feel unsafe, but maybe you're not actually really unsafe, right? I think is what I hear you saying. But thoughts
Yeah.
about
Because
that?
it goes back to our written, we're wired to survive. So it goes back to our prehistoric ancestors. And so we're just a modern day version of them. They had to be ready to physically respond. And this is something that Peter Levine, he's the father of somatic experiencing. He has a quote that our survival is going to be more dependent today on our ability to think rather than physically respond. So we noticing, being curious, and being able to distinguish between what is a real and perceived threat. So in the example of being in a meeting, that noticing is vital. You being familiar with, okay, if my heart starts beating or I feel a little tense, that's my 6 second warning. And just and knowing that you can. A lot of people think they can't control their emotions, but they can. So something like, okay, is this unsafe or just uncomfortable? Getting present by putting, can I feel my feet on the floor? Seeing and sensing is another one. Being able to scan the room, find something that's pleasing to look at. That will also
Mhm.
bring down, calm the nervous system so we stay connected to our prefrontal cortex.
Cortex. Six
And my
seconds.
clients say
What's the
that,
six?
oh,
I'm
I'm sorry,
sorry.
go
Your
ahead.
clients say.
They say that the most challenging part is remembering to do it. That in
Yeah,
and
of
of
course.
itself, it's not hard, but it's remembering to do it. And that's where coaching is very helpful because I get to try it out in different scenarios and, learn a new behavior that can serve them better than physically responding,
For
exercising their
sure. Well,
strategic
what's
thinking.
the significance, Jennifer, for the 6 seconds? I mean, what's that about?
Oh yeah. Okay. So the 6 seconds is the window that we have from, because again, the body knows first. So from we've got 6 seconds, say, if I notice my heart is really beating, I've got 6 seconds before my body gets mobilized
Hmm.
with the, stress hormones that are going to put me in a position to mobilize into a fight, flight, or immobilize into a freeze response. And either one of those cases,
Withdrawal.
we're not using our strategic thinking. And it takes us a while to come out of that. I refer to it as, being under the influence, like the alcoholic influence of, the amygdala. And it takes a while to come, like an alcoholic influence, it takes a while to come out of that. Same thing when
Yeah,
the body's flooded with stress hormones.
yeah. How did you get interested in this? Out of curiosity.
Oh my gosh, I love this. Well, when I first heard about Peter's work, I'm like, wait a minute, that's a thing? I've been doing this my whole life. And I had been doing it with clients too. I'm like, well, wait a minute.
That's
And
funny.
yeah. And so then I'm like, we did this in the business world. And so that led to writing the book, and that's led to my 3N
Yeah.
model, which is notice, name, navigate. Those are the principles of, um, executing somatic awareness. And with
Hmm.
what I find fascinating,
So
Michael.
notice, name, navigate. So notice
Yeah.
is that noticing the body is tensing up, or something's happening, or your heart is beating, or
Yes.
yeah, you're moving out of some kind of more equilibrium kind of state into a more activated state, right? What's the name
Exactly.
part? What's the name
The
part?
the name part is being able to name it for what it is, because naming provides meaning. And
Mm,
so, when people first, it's enough for them just to name it. Okay, this is a threat response, which
mm,
is some, then you can dive deeper into, there's a ton of flavors of a threat response. But in the moment, just,
mm,
no, recognizing, okay, this is a threat response. Okay, I have resources. The more resource we feel, the safer we feel. Safer we feel, the more creative we
mm,
can be. And
mm.
then you can, kind of navigate into that safe space where, okay, I'm safe enough, and keep connected to my strategic thinking and come up with, start thinking outside the box instead
That's the
of it's,
navigate part, I take it, right?
yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Did you come up with that notice name navigate? That's really nice. I
Uh-huh.
mean, that's
Yeah.
very nice. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Thank you.
simple and it alliterates, and I'm a big fan of alliteration. So as a memory aid, and it's got three things, which so it's got all the features, right, of things that are easy to remember, which is terrifically helpful. Yeah. So
Yes, yeah,
yeah,
and
no,
my
no,
clients informed it, so, with
yeah,
their
no, it's
feedback,
super interesting. Right?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
It's funny because I'm writing the third edition of the first 90 days, right? So the book originally was published back in 2003. Um, and then I wrote a second edition in 2013, and I had originally planned to publish a third edition in 2023, but I'm struggling, I guess is the right word, to
Mm, mhm.
get it done. Just I got sort of so caught up in what was going on with AI and kind of went off on a little bit of a. But I think, but it was important, right? Because it's just
Yes,
so critical to what's going on, and I wasn't going to miss, you know, um, engaging around it. But
yeah,
you can imagine some of the changes since 2003, right? Um, both in terms of the context of leadership, right? The different global environment we're operating in, virtual work wasn't really a thing at all in 2013, so well, there wasn't much in the book
mhm,
about it. So there's stuff that is going to go in the new edition, or I'm putting in the new edition, that's about how the context of leadership is different than it was. But there's
yeah,
also just stuff I've learned and come to think is more important, right?
sure,
And so at the end of the book, the ninth chapter of the book is a chapter on managing yourself. And in I think both the first and second editions, I kind of waved my arms at managing yourself, said you need to be focused, you need to, blah, 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 right? But it's become really obvious, and I think it's that your work is exactly on point with this, that managing yourself is a much deeper set of
yeah,
things, right, that you need to
yes,
do as a leader, especially when you're taking a new role. And so I'm
mhm,
working on the new edition of that chapter, and it's going to revolve around three basic things, right? One is um, energy, right? And how you
yes,
mobilize and focus and sustain your energy. The second is emotions and regulation, right? I've been doing with my wife quite a bit of work around a framework called schema therapy, if you're familiar with it.
oh, no, I'd
Yeah,
love to
it's
know more
worth,
about
I'll
that.
send you an article that we wrote on it. It's
Yes,
basically
please,
about what are some of the deep, learned things that we learn early that cause us to be triggered. So
yes,
it's a school
that's
of,
a big part of it.
psychotherapy, right?
Uh,
And then the third thing is really endurance, right? How do you stay resilient in the midst of all those things? Now, again, that's three
mhm.
things, and it alliterates, right? So you're in good company around how sort of think things, right? But
Yes,
but I think that second one, I mean, energy. I've come to believe that energy is at the core of leadership, right? The
oh,
core of what
definitely.
leaders do is mobilize and focus and sustain the energy of people and organizations. But you can't hope
Mhm.
to do that if you can't do it yourself, right? So it's a whole piece about how do you stay energized. And I've got a
Yes.
colleague, one of the coaches I work with at IMD, Francesca Maria, that wrote a nice little book about energy and your batteries and how you think about
Oh,
some of that
yeah.
stuff,
Oh,
which is
I'd love to
super important.
hear. Yeah, I would love to
Yeah,
read that. And I know I could talk to you forever. And I remember you saying that you had a hard stop. So,
I do, sadly.
yeah.
Yeah, but listen, no, but this has been great, Jennifer, and I really enjoyed the conversation. I'll look forward to taking a deeper look at the book. But I think it's I applaud the work you're doing, right? Because I think it's super important. And
Well,
as I said, I've been sort of grappling with it you know, from not from the perspective you came from, which is a great perspective, I think, but it's
Mhm.
super important work to be focused on, and especially when we see people under so much stress these days.
Yes.
I mean, a lot of the
Yes.
people I work with are just under so much pressure, right? It's kind
They
of the
are.
operative word is the pressure that you're feeling. It's anyway, lovely to
Absolutely.
talk. Thank you for
Yes, you
inviting me.
too. Yes, thank you so
Enjoyed
very
it very
much,
much.
Michael
Of course,
Watkins.
it is me, Jennifer. That it is you. Take care.
It
Thank
is
you.
me.